Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. A guy named Jake worked next door to me in my first fast food joint job. He was really friendly, would come in and flirt, seemed completely normal. His mom even worked as a manager in the shop next door and helped get him the job. At that time, I was young myself, still figuring out adulthood in small steps. That job was nothing special, just greasy counters, long shifts, and the kind of coworkers you forget once you move on. Jake blended right in. He smiled easily, joked with everyone, and never raised any red flags. If anything, he seemed like one of those people who just drift through life without causing problems. Customers liked him. Managers trusted him. He didn't look dangerous. He didn't sound dangerous. He was just there. The summer before my final year of school is when everything changed. It was one of those summers that felt ordinary at first. Warm days, nothing dramatic, the usual boredom mixed with small moments of excitement about the future. My younger sister was about to enter her first year at our school. She was around 12 or 13, right at that age where kids are still children but starting to think they're grown. She was excited, nervous, trying to act confident, while still holding on to that softness that only kids have. Around that time, she started texting someone. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. Teenagers text people all the time. Phones buzz constantly. It's easy to miss when something isn't right. But this wasn't someone her age. This was a guy in his early 20s. Old enough that even my own manager used to look uncomfortable when Jake flirted with me, because I was only 17 or 18. Back then, adults noticed those age gaps. They felt wrong. But somehow no one noticed what was happening with my sister. The messages started innocent enough, at least on the surface. Compliments, attention. The kind of words that make a young girl feel special, grown up, chosen, someone older paying attention. Feels like validation when you're that age. You don't see danger, you see excitement. You see someone who makes you feel important. Eventually, they met up. That detail alone still makes my stomach turn. A child meeting a grown man, thinking it's normal, thinking it's safe. She trusted him. She had no reason not to. He had built that trust carefully, step by step, through words and attention and fake kindness. What happened next is the part that never leaves you, no matter how much time passes. He tried to force her to do things she wasn't ready for. Things she didn't understand, things no child should ever be asked to do. She refused. She said no. She tried to set boundaries in the only way she knew how. When she realized she couldn't escape the situation easily, she tried to offer something else, thinking it would make him stop, thinking it would keep her safe. It didn't. Instead of stopping, instead of backing away, instead of acting like a human being, he became violent. What followed wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an accident. It was rape. And during that assault, he killed her. Later, he claimed he was just trying to silence her, as if those words could ever explain or soften what he did. Afterward, he dumped her body in our local canal, a place people walked past every day, a place that used to feel normal and safe. An old man found her while walking his dog. Just a normal morning turned into something horrifying. One moment, he was taking his usual walk. The next, he was discovering something that would haunt him forever. The entire area changed overnight. News spread fast. Police cars, tape, whispers, crying families. Everyone knew something terrible had happened. But at first, no one wanted to believe it was that bad. People don't want to imagine the worst, especially when it happens close to home. Especially when it involves someone they might know. When the truth came out, It felt unreal, like the ground dropped out from under us. Jake, that guy, the friendly one, the normal one, the one whose mom worked nearby, the one who joked and smiled and flirted like he was harmless. He wasn't just a creep, he wasn't just inappropriate, he was a rapist, a pedophile, a murderer. I had known creeps my whole life. People who gave off bad vibes, people who made your skin crawl the second they opened their mouths. Jake wasn't like that. If someone had asked me before all this happened, I would have said he was annoying, maybe a little too flirty, but nothing more. I would never have pegged him as capable of something so evil. That's what makes it so terrifying. The idea that monsters don't always look like monsters. They don't always lurk in dark alleys or act openly threatening. Sometimes they smile at you. Sometimes they stand next to you at work. Sometimes their parents work respectable jobs and help them get hired. Sometimes they blend in so well that no one questions them. After her death, everything felt heavier. Our school halls felt colder. Parents were suddenly stricter. Kids were quieter. Trust disappeared. The canal became a symbol of horror instead of just another part of town. People avoided it. Even driving past it felt wrong. For my family, the pain was unimaginable. Losing a child in such a violent, senseless way leaves a hole that never closes. There is no moving on from something like that. There is only learning how to breathe around the pain. Every birthday that never came, every milestone that would never be reached, every ordinary moment that now carried grief. I kept replaying my memories of Jake over and over, every interaction, every smile, every casual moment. I questioned myself constantly. Had I missed something? Had there been signs? Could anyone have stopped it? Those questions don't have answers, but they don't stop coming. What haunted me most was how normal everything had seemed, right up until it wasn't. How easily a child was targeted, how easily adults overlooked the danger, how quickly life shattered. Even now, years later, I think about how many people like him exist, hidden in plain sight. People who know how to appear harmless, people who take advantage of trust, youth, and silence. It changed the way I see the world forever. I don't believe anymore that you can always tell who someone really is. Evil doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits. Sometimes it looks just like a guy named Jake who works next door and smiles like nothing is wrong. When I worked at a lumber yard several years ago, the supervisor would come around twice a year and regale us with horror stories of accidents, so we would know why certain safety protocols were in place. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It felt like one of those routine workplace things, almost like a lecture you half listen to while standing around in dusty boots and high-visibility vests. We would gather near the break area or on the shop floor, coffee in hand, and the supervisor would start talking. He had a calm voice, not dramatic, not emotional. That almost made it worse. These weren't stories meant to scare us for entertainment. They were warnings. The lumberyard itself was a loud, gritty place. Constant noise from saws, forklifts beeping, machines humming and clanking all day long. There was always sawdust in the air. It settled on your clothes, in your hair, in your lungs. By the end of a shift, you felt it in your throat. The work was physical and repetitive. You learned quickly that the machines didn't care who you were. They didn't slow down for mistakes. They didn't forgive. The supervisor explained that these talks weren't just policy. They were about survival. Every rule, every checklist, every lock and tag existed because someone somewhere had been injured or killed when it wasn't followed. Most of us nodded along, thinking we understood. But understanding something in theory is very different from feeling it settle into your bones. One of the mills we supplied had a plywood press. On the surface, it sounded simple enough. Wood material is placed into the press, layers stacked carefully, and then the machine compresses everything together into plywood boards. It's slow, methodical, almost boring to watch. No sparks, no flying blades, just pressure. Massive, unstoppable pressure. The supervisor described how the press worked in more detail. It was designed to close gradually, applying steady force until the boards reached a specific thickness. 3/4-inch plywood was common. Strong, solid, uniform. Something you'd never question once it left the mill and ended up in a building or on a truck. What most people didn't think about was maintenance. Over time, debris would build up inside the press. Bits of wood, resin, glue, dust. Periodically, it had to be cleaned. And that meant a worker physically entering the press to scrape and remove whatever was left behind. That alone should have set off alarms in everyone's head. A human body entering a machine designed to crush wood into dense sheets. But this was normal in the industry. Procedures existed for a reason. The press was supposed to be fully shut down, the power switch locked out, tags placed so no one could accidentally activate it. Everyone trained, everyone aware. In this story, that didn't happen. The shut-off switch was not locked out. Someone somewhere either didn't realize a worker was inside or didn't check properly. Maybe they were rushing. Maybe they assumed maintenance was done. Maybe they thought someone else had already handled the lockout. Whatever the reason, the press was triggered to activate. The supervisor paused when he got to this part. Not for effect, just because he always did. Like he'd told this story enough times that he knew where the weight of it landed. The press did not move quickly. That detail stuck with me more than anything else. It wasn't an instant, explosive accident. It was slow, steady, relentless. There was time for awareness, time for panic, time to realize exactly what was happening with no way to stop it. A guy was definitely inside while it ran. The thickness setting, if the supervisor remembered correctly, was set to 3/4 inch. No one needed him to explain what that meant. Everyone standing there could picture it. A machine designed to compress wood down to less than an inch. A human body caught in that process. There were no graphic details given. None were needed. The silence after that sentence was enough. That story changed the atmosphere every time it was told. People shifted their weight. Some stared at the floor, others clenched their jaws. You could feel the message sink in. This wasn't about rules on paper. This was about going home alive. The supervisor always ended that story the same way. Lock out your equipment, not shouted, not dramatic, just stated like a fact of life. After hearing it the first time, I found myself thinking about it more than I expected. I'd be loading lumber or walking past machinery and suddenly picture that press. Picture how quiet it must have been before it started moving, how normal the day probably felt before everything went wrong. The more I worked there, the more I noticed how easily small shortcuts could creep in. Someone skipping a step because they were tired. Someone assuming another worker had already done something. Someone trusting that a machine was off because it usually was. None of it came from bad intentions. It came from routine. And routine is dangerous when you're surrounded by machines that can kill you. The pay never matched the risk. That was another thing that started bothering me. Long hours, physically demanding work, constant noise, constant hazards, and for what? Enough money to get by, maybe. Enough to justify it if everything went right. But if something went wrong, the cost was everything. I started noticing injuries more. Crushed fingers, bad backs, hearing loss, near misses people laughed off afterward, even though they shouldn't have. It became clear that the horror stories weren't rare exceptions. They were part of the industry's history, written in blood and broken bodies. Eventually, I got out of the lumber industry. Hearing that story was a big part of it. Not because I was scared in the moment, but because it planted a seed that kept growing. The realization that no amount of experience or confidence could fully protect you. All it took was one missed step, one unlocked switch, one assumption. I still think about that plywood press sometimes, about how slow it moved, about how preventable it was, about how many accidents come down to simple things that people think won't matter just this once. If someone asks me now about working in lumber, I'm honest. It's dangerous work for very low pay. If you're going to be involved in the industry, be a lumber broker. Much more lucrative and much safer. Stay away from the machines if you can, because the machines don't care if you're careful most of the time. They only care about that one moment when something goes wrong, and once they start moving, they don't stop for regret. I had a friend who went to study abroad in Russia for a short program. It was something she had dreamed about for years. She had always wanted to travel, experience a different culture, and live somewhere unfamiliar, even if only for a little while. When she finally got the opportunity, she was excited but also nervous. She was alone in a foreign country, far from her family and friends in America, trying to adjust to a new language, new food, and a completely different way of life. She had been there for about a month when she decided to download Tinder. At first, it was mostly out of curiosity and boredom. She didn't know many people, and her classes didn't leave much room for socializing. Tinder felt like an easy way to talk to locals, practice conversation, and maybe make a few friends. She wasn't seriously looking for anything romantic. Most of the conversations were casual, sometimes awkward, and often fizzled out quickly. Toward the end of her stay, though, she matched with a guy who felt different from the rest. From their first conversation, there was an easy flow between them. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in her as a person, not just as a foreign student. They talked about music, food, travel, and their lives. He asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to her answers. She felt comfortable with him in a way she hadn't felt with anyone else she had met there. They decided to meet in person, and their first date went surprisingly well. There were no awkward silences, no strange moments. They laughed a lot and talked for hours. She went home that night feeling happy and a little surprised by how much she liked him. After that, they kept seeing each other. One date turned into 2, then 3, then more. In total, they went on 6 dates, and each one felt better than the last. They explored the city together, tried new restaurants, walked through parks, and talked late into the night. He always seemed respectful and kind. He never pushed her into anything she wasn't comfortable with. Because of that, she began to trust him. She knew her time in Russia was almost over, which made everything feel more intense. There was a sense that this connection was temporary, something special that existed only because of the limited time they had. Their final date was the night before she was scheduled to fly back to America. There was a bittersweet feeling hanging over the evening. They both knew it was their last chance to see each other. They went out to eat at a nice place, talked about her upcoming flight, and joked about how strange it felt to say goodbye so soon after meeting. After dinner, he invited her back to his apartment. She hesitated for a moment but agreed to go, telling herself it would just be a short visit. She had no intention of staying the night or sleeping with him. In her mind, it was simply a way to spend a little more time together before she left the country. When they arrived at his place, everything seemed normal. The apartment was clean and quiet. They talked for a bit, sitting close to each other, but she kept checking the time. Eventually, she stood up and said she should probably head back to her own apartment so she could finish packing and get some rest before her flight. That was when his mood changed. At first, it was subtle. He sighed, looked disappointed, and said she didn't have to rush. He told her she could stay a little longer, that they might not see each other again. She repeated that she really needed to go. He then suggested giving her a back massage, saying she looked tense and tired from traveling and studying. She didn't want to make things awkward, and she didn't feel threatened at that moment. She agreed, but very clearly told him that she would still be leaving afterward. He said he understood. He asked her to lie down on the bed, face down, and he brought out some lotion. He began rubbing it into her back, working slowly. At first, it felt normal, even relaxing. She closed her eyes and tried to enjoy the moment without overthinking it. But after a few minutes, she noticed a strange sensation. Her skin began to feel warm, then hot. It wasn't the pleasant warmth of a massage. It started to sting. She told herself she was probably just tired or imagining it. When he finished, she sat up and said she really had to go now. That was when his behavior changed completely. He became angry, not just disappointed. His voice grew sharper. He told her she had to stay. He said she couldn't leave yet. When she laughed nervously and tried to brush it off, he repeated himself, more forcefully. He stood between her and the door. Fear rushed through her all at once. This was no longer uncomfortable or awkward. It was dangerous. She told him again that she was leaving, her heart pounding in her chest. He raised his voice and said she wasn't allowed to go. In that moment, something in his expression made her realize how serious he was. She didn't argue anymore. She didn't try to reason with him. As soon as she saw a chance, she ran. She pushed past him, grabbed her coat, and rushed out the door. She didn't stop until she was back at her own apartment, shaking and out of breath. She locked the door behind her and sat on the floor, trying to calm herself down. That night, she barely slept. Every sound made her jump. Her back continued to burn, but she assumed it was just irritation from the massage, or maybe an allergic reaction to the lotion. She told herself she was safe now. She was leaving the country in the morning. Whatever had happened was over. When she woke up the next day, the pain was much worse. Her back felt like it was on fire. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a rash spreading across her skin. It was red, inflamed, and angry-looking. She touched it gently and winced. Something was very wrong. Terrified and in pain, she went to the emergency room. She explained that she was a foreign student and that she had developed a severe rash overnight. The doctor examined her back carefully. His expression changed almost immediately. He told her to wait and left the room quickly. She sat there alone for a long time, feeling confused and scared. Her thoughts raced. She wondered if she had caught some strange illness or had a severe allergic reaction. The pain continued to worsen and she fought back tears. Eventually the door opened again, but instead of just the doctor, police officers walked in. They asked her where she had been recently and who she had been with. Her confusion turned into fear. She told them everything. She talked about the dates, the dinner, going back to his apartment, the massage, and how she had run away when he tried to stop her from leaving. The police left the room, and once again she was alone. When they returned, the doctor came with them. He sat down and explained what they believed had happened. The lotion the man had used on her back was not lotion at all. It was meat tenderizer. The chemicals in it were designed to break down muscle tissue, which explained the burning pain and severe rash. The doctor told her that if she had stayed longer, the damage could have been much worse. Once the hospital staff realized what substance had been used, they contacted the police immediately. Officers had gone to the man's apartment while she was being examined. When they searched his home, they found something horrifying. His freezer was filled with human meat. The man had planned to kill her. He had intended to eat her. The massage was the first step. If she hadn't run when she did, she might not have survived the night. She had trusted him. She had laughed with him, shared meals with him, walked through the city with him, never suspecting what he truly was. The realization hit her all at once. leaving her shaking and sick to her stomach. She returned to America shortly after, physically recovering but emotionally scarred. Even now, years later, she struggles to trust people the way she once did. She knows how close she came to never coming home at all. He wanted to eat her, and he almost did. I live in a fairly quiet neighborhood in Arkansas. It's the kind of place where nothing ever really happens, and that's exactly why I liked it. The subdivision sits at the end of a dead-end road, with only a small number of houses lined up neatly along the street. There's no through traffic, no loud parties, and no strangers wandering around. I live in the second-to-last house before the road ends, and the very last house belongs to an old man who lived alone next door to me. Most of the neighbors are friendly in a casual, familiar way. We wave when we see each other, stop to chat about the weather, complain about rising prices, or talk about yard work. It's nothing deep, but it's comfortable. Everyone knows everyone else well enough to feel safe. Everyone, that is, except for the old man next door. For the sake of this story, I'll call him Edward. Edward lived in the last house at the end of the subdivision, just a few yards from mine. His house was close enough that I could see his porch clearly from my front window. We had spoken a handful of times over the years, but never for long, just short exchanges, polite but distant. He knew my name and I knew his, but that was about it. He was private, quiet, and seemed to prefer it that way. Over the past year especially, he had become even more withdrawn. I rarely saw him outside, and when I did, he avoided conversation. I knew he was older, and I knew he was a war veteran. Beyond that, I didn't know much. I assumed he had family somewhere. I thought he had a wife, though I never saw her. Nothing about him struck me as particularly strange at the time. Just an old man keeping to himself. Then came the craziest day I have ever experienced. It started early in the morning, far earlier than I wanted to be awake. I jolted awake at exactly 5:43 a.m. to the sound of someone yelling my name. At first, I thought it was part of a dream. The sound didn't make sense, and I was still half asleep. But then I heard it again, louder this time. My name being shouted from outside. Before I could even fully process what was happening, my fiancé sat straight up in bed and looked at me. He had heard it too. We both rushed to the window and looked outside. The sky was just starting to lighten, the early morning air still heavy and quiet. That's when we saw him. Edward was lying face down in the dirt at the bottom of the stairs leading up to his porch. We didn't stop to think. We threw on shoes and ran outside as fast as we could. As we got closer, it was clear that something was very wrong. He looked hurt, badly hurt. He wasn't moving much, and his breathing sounded strained. We asked him if he needed an ambulance. The answer seemed obvious to us. Anyone who had been lying face down in the dirt, yelling for help at dawn, needed medical attention. But as soon as we said the word ambulance, his tone changed. He snapped at us almost angrily. "No, just get me up," he said. We tried again, telling him that at the very least we could help him back inside his house. Once again he cut us off. "No, just get me up to the chair on my porch and I'll be fine." Something about the way he said it made me uneasy. He wasn't confused. He wasn't panicked. He was forceful. Almost desperate, but not in the way someone usually is when they're injured. Still, we tried to help him sit up, but he was heavier than he looked, and he winced in pain when we moved him. We asked him what had happened. After a moment, he began to explain. He told us that around 10 o'clock the night before, he had heard a noise outside. He said it sounded like something on his porch. An animal, maybe. He went out to check, and because it was dark, he didn't see it clearly. Whatever it was bolted toward him, and when he tried to run, he tripped and fell down the stairs. My fiancé's face went pale. "Oh my God," he said. You mean you've been laying out here since 10 last night? Edward brushed it off like it was nothing. He said he was fine. He told us to just leave him there, that he would be okay on his own. That didn't sit right with either of us. We knew he was badly hurt, and the idea that he had been lying there all night was horrifying. We also knew he had family, or at least we thought he did. I asked if we could call someone for him, a family member, anyone. No, he said flatly. There isn't anyone. My fiancé asked if his wife was living with him. No, Edward replied. I live alone. That answer felt strange, but we didn't push it. At that point, we didn't know what else to do. He refused medical help. He refused to go inside. He refused to let us call anyone. Eventually, we went back into our house, but neither of us felt good about it. We talked it over for a few minutes. We both agreed that something was wrong. Edward was a war veteran, and we wondered if maybe he wasn't fully aware of how badly hurt he was. Or maybe he was in shock. Either way, we couldn't just ignore it, so we called the police. We explained everything. We told them about finding him outside, his injuries, his refusal to get help, and the fact that he claimed to live alone. We asked them to do a welfare check. About 15 minutes later, we saw a police cruiser pull up to Edward's house. 2 officers got out and walked up to his porch. They knocked on the door and called his name. There was no answer. They walked around the house, peering through windows, trying to see inside. I watched from my yard, my stomach slowly tightening. One of the officers then turned and started walking toward my house. I stepped outside to meet him. I asked if they had checked on Edward. The officer looked at me, his expression serious. He's dead, he said. The words didn't make sense. What do you mean he's dead? I shouted. I just talked to him. The officer explained that they could see a body lying on the kitchen floor through one of the windows. From their perspective, it looked like Edward had collapsed inside the house. He told me that his senior officer was calling it in. Since they believed there was a deceased person inside, that gave them probable cause to enter the house. The front door was locked, so they kicked it in. What they found inside was far worse than anything any of us could have imagined. Edward wasn't dead yet, but someone else was. In the kitchen, they found Edward alive, injured and barely conscious. But in another room, sitting in a chair with a blanket draped over her, was his wife. She had been dead for months. The officers estimated that she had been dead for 4 to 6 months. Her body had been sitting there the entire time, positioned carefully in a chair as if she were resting. Edward had knocked out a window in the house to let the smell escape. He had never left the house since her death. As the investigation continued, the truth became even more disturbing. Parts of the skin on her face were missing. Sections of her neck showed signs of having been sliced with a knife. The medical examiner believed that Edward had been peeling her skin and eating it. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. I felt sick. I felt dizzy. For the past 6 months, while I had been living my normal life, going to work, sleeping in my bed, and waving at neighbors, something unspeakable had been happening right next door. Every time I had seen Edward's house, every time I had walked past it, every time I had assumed nothing was wrong, he had been inside, slowly consuming his wife's body. The noise he claimed to have heard that night, it might not have been an animal at all, or maybe it was, but the fall down the stairs was the only reason anyone found out. That thought still haunts me. If he hadn't heard that noise, if he hadn't fallen, if he hadn't been forced to call out for help, how long would it have gone on? How long would he have continued sitting in that house, peeling and eating her flesh, unnoticed by everyone around him? I still live in that house. The neighborhood is quiet again, but it will never feel the same. Every time I look at that empty house at the end of the road, I'm reminded of how close evil can be and how easily it can hide in plain sight. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. During the First World War, there was a Russian fortress that stood between the German army and a nearby town filled with civilians. The fort itself was old, damaged, and never meant to withstand a long siege. The Russian military knew this from the beginning. They knew the fort would eventually fall, but what mattered was time. Every extra hour the fort remained standing meant more civilians could be evacuated from the town behind it. Women, children, the elderly, and anyone who couldn't fight were being moved out as quickly as possible, and the fort was the only thing slowing the German advance. The Russian soldiers stationed there understood their role clearly. They were not defending the fort because they believed they would win. They were defending it because they were buying time with their lives. Most of them were young men. Some were barely trained. Others were veterans who had already seen too much death. All of them knew that retreat was not an option. If the Germans broke through too quickly, the town behind them would be overrun. For days, the Germans attacked relentlessly. Artillery shells slammed into the fort, shaking the ground and tearing chunks of stone from the walls. Explosions echoed constantly, day and night, leaving the defenders exhausted and deafened. Supplies ran low, food was rationed, water became scarce. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Still, the Russians held their positions. They fired back when they could and repaired what little damage they were able to under constant bombardment. The Germans grew impatient. The fort should have fallen already, yet it continued to resist. Each delay frustrated them further. Eventually, German commanders decided to use a weapon that would end the resistance quickly. They chose poison gas. At that point in the war, gas warfare was still relatively new. The Russians inside the fort had no gas masks, no protective equipment, no real way to defend themselves against it. When the gas attack began, thick clouds rolled across the battlefield and seeped into the fort through cracks, openings, and shattered walls. The air became unbreathable. The gas burned the lungs, eyes, and skin. Soldiers began coughing violently almost immediately. Inside the fort, chaos erupted. Men tried to cover their faces with rags, shirts, anything they could find. It didn't help. The gas filled their lungs, tearing them apart from the inside. Some collapsed where they stood. Others crawled blindly along the ground, choking and gasping for air that no longer existed. The pain was unbearable. Lungs burned, throats swelled shut, eyes filled with blood and tears. For hours, the gas lingered. From the German perspective, the attack had worked perfectly. No human being could survive that amount of poison without protection. Eventually, the firing stopped. The battlefield fell quiet. The Germans waited, confident that everyone inside the fort was dead. After several hours passed with no return fire, German troops began to advance. Thousands of soldiers moved forward cautiously, expecting to find nothing but corpses. They believed they were walking into an empty ruin, a fort filled only with the dead. What they did not expect was movement. As the gas began to thin, shapes emerged from the smoke. At first, the Germans thought they were seeing things. Figures stumbled forward slowly, unevenly. Then they realized these were men. Russian soldiers, about 60 of them. They were barely alive. Their uniforms were torn and soaked in blood. Their faces were swollen, burned, and discolored. Blood streamed from their noses and mouths. Many were coughing violently, vomiting pieces of their own lungs and intestines onto the ground as they moved. Some had their rifles clutched in shaking hands. Others dragged themselves forward, driven by pure will alone. These men should not have been able to stand, let alone charge. But they did. With what little strength they had left, the surviving Russian soldiers began advancing toward the Germans. They didn't run so much as stagger forward, screaming, coughing, choking, and firing when they could. Their voices sounded unnatural, like something no longer fully human. Their bodies were already dying, but they refused to stop. The sight was beyond horrifying. To the German soldiers, it looked like the dead were rising from the gas itself. Bloody, broken figures stumbling forward, faces half destroyed, coughing up pieces of themselves as they attacked. Panic spread instantly. No one had prepared them for this. No one had told them that men could still fight after being exposed to that much poison. Fear took over. Despite their overwhelming numbers, the German soldiers broke. Thousands of men turned and ran from fewer than 60 dying defenders. Orders were ignored. Formation collapsed. Soldiers trampled over one another in their desperation to escape. Weapons were dropped. Some fell and were crushed underfoot by their own comrades. The Russian charge did not last long. One by one, the men collapsed. Their bodies finally gave out. The poison had done its work. Within a short time, every one of those 60 soldiers was dead or dying, but their attack had achieved something no one thought possible. The Germans retreated. The fort remained in Russian hands longer than anyone had expected. The delay gave enough time for the evacuation behind the fort to be completed. Civilians were moved out of danger. Supplies were relocated. Even more importantly, Russian engineers were able to plant explosives throughout the fort. When the time finally came and the Russians could no longer hold their position, they detonated the charges. The fort was destroyed from within, ensuring that the Germans could not use it as a base or defensive position. What remained was rubble and ash, useless to the advancing army. The men who defended the fort did not live to see what they had accomplished. Their deaths were slow, painful, and terrifying, but their sacrifice changed the course of events in that area of the war. They held the line when it mattered most. News of the battle spread quickly. A local newspaper later gave the event a name that would echo through history. They called it the Attack of the Dead Men. Even now, more than a century later, the story remains one of the most haunting moments of the First World War. It is a reminder of how far human beings can be pushed and how terrifying the human will to survive can become. Those soldiers were already dying. Their bodies were failing them, yet they chose to stand up one last time, not for glory, not for victory, but to protect people they would never see again. They did not win the battle in the traditional sense. They did something far more disturbing and powerful. They turned themselves into something the enemy could not face, even with superior numbers and weapons. They became a nightmare that rose out of the gas, and for one unforgettable moment, death itself charged the battlefield. My uncle used to tell this story whenever the conversation drifted toward strange experiences or things that couldn't be easily explained. He wasn't the kind of man who exaggerated or told stories just to scare people. In fact, he was usually pretty calm and practical, which is why this story always stuck with me. He swore it happened exactly the way he described it, and even years later, he never changed a single detail. At the time, he was driving down to Laredo, Texas for work. It wasn't unusual for him to make long drives alone. He actually preferred it that way. He liked the quiet, the open road, and the time to think. This particular trip was nothing special. Just another drive, another job, another night spent on the highway. It was late, well past midnight. The highway was mostly empty, stretching out ahead of him in long, dark lines. There were no streetlights in that area, just the occasional glow from passing headlights far in the distance. The radio was on low. more for background noise than anything else. He remembers feeling tired but alert, focused on staying awake and getting where he needed to go. As he drove, his headlights swept over the road and the shoulder on either side. That's when he noticed something unusual up ahead. At first, he thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog. But as he got closer, he realized it was a person. It was a woman walking slowly along the side of the highway. That alone was strange. People didn't usually walk along that stretch of road, especially not at that hour. What made it even stranger was what she was wearing. She had on a nightgown, not a dress or casual clothes, but something that looked like sleepwear. Thin fabric, light-colored, moving slightly in the breeze as she walked. My uncle immediately felt uneasy, but his first instinct wasn't fear. It was concern. He thought maybe she had been in an accident. Maybe her car had broken down. Maybe she was hurt or confused. The idea of leaving someone alone on the highway in the middle of the night didn't sit right with him. So he slowed down. He pulled his truck closer to the shoulder, keeping a safe distance, but close enough to see her clearly. She didn't look back. She didn't wave or signal for help. She just kept walking, her pace slow and steady, like she hadn't noticed him at all. That made him hesitate. Most people would react somehow to a vehicle pulling up next to them, especially at night. Still, he told himself that she might be scared. Or maybe she didn't hear him over the sound of the road. He rolled down his window and matched her speed, driving slowly beside her. He called out to her, asking if she was okay and if she needed help. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she stopped. She turned her head toward him, and that was when everything changed. He said her movement was sudden and unnatural, like a switch had been flipped. 1 second she was just standing there, and the next, she lunged toward his truck. She didn't walk or step closer. She plunged at him, fast and aggressive, her arms reaching out toward the open window. My uncle didn't wait to see what she would do next. Pure instinct took over. He slammed his foot on the gas and sped away, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. He didn't look back right away. All he could think about was getting distance between himself and whatever that was. After several seconds, when he felt he was far enough away, he slowed down slightly and glanced in his rearview mirror. There was no one there. The road behind him was empty. No woman, no movement, nothing but darkness and the faint line of the highway disappearing into the night. He told me that was the moment fear really set in. Not when she lunged at him, but when she vanished. There was nowhere she could have gone that fast. No side roads, no bushes thick enough to hide in, just open land and empty highway. He pulled over a few minutes later, his hands shaking. He sat there with the engine running, scanning the road in both directions, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He considered turning around, but the thought of going back filled him with dread. Whatever he had seen, he didn't want to encounter it again. Eventually, he kept driving. The rest of the trip passed without incident, but he said he never truly relaxed again that night. Every shadow on the side of the road made him tense. Every shape in the distance made his stomach drop. He arrived at his destination exhausted, not just from the drive, but from the fear that lingered long after the encounter. When he told the story later, people reacted in different ways. Some laughed it off, saying it was probably just a prank or someone high on drugs. Others suggested he was tired and imagined it. But my uncle always shook his head at those explanations. He knew what he saw. He knew how real it felt. What made the story even more unsettling was that he wasn't the only one. Over time, I started hearing bits and pieces about similar sightings along that same stretch of highway near Laredo. Stories of a woman walking alone at night. Stories of drivers slowing down to help, only to feel sudden fear or see her disappear. None of the stories were exactly the same, but the details lined up enough to make them hard to ignore. A woman on the roadside, late at night. wearing a nightgown. Some people claimed she would just vanish when approached. Others said she would suddenly appear in front of vehicles, forcing drivers to swerve. A few mentioned feeling watched long after passing through the area, like something had followed them. There was never a clear explanation, no official reports, no confirmed incidents that could tie the sightings to a real person, no records of accidents or missing women that matched the description. The stories existed mostly as whispers, passed from one person to another, often brushed aside as local legends or highway folklore. Still, the consistency was hard to ignore. My uncle never claimed to know what she was. He didn't say she was a ghost or something supernatural. He just said that whatever he encountered that night didn't feel human. The way she moved, the speed of her lunge, the way she disappeared without a trace. None of it made sense. He avoided that stretch of road after that. If he had to drive near Laredo again, he took different routes, even if they added hours to his trip. He said no job was worth seeing that again. What unsettles me the most is how ordinary it all started. A quiet highway, a tired driver, a person who seemed like she needed help. There was nothing dramatic or obviously threatening at first. Just a simple decision to slow down and be kind. That's what makes the story stick with me. Because if he hadn't slowed down, if he hadn't tried to help, he might never have known she was there at all. She would have remained just another shadow on the side of the road, another mystery passing unnoticed in the dark. And I can't help but wonder how many other people have seen her, how many slowed down, how many didn't, how many might have stopped completely. I don't know if there's a larger story tied to her. I don't know if there's a tragic event that explains why she appears there, walking endlessly along the highway in the middle of the night. All I know is that my uncle believed what he saw, and the fear in his voice when he told the story was real. Even now, whenever I drive at night and see someone on the side of the road, I think about that woman in the nightgown. I think about how quickly something ordinary can turn into something terrifying. And I think about how some roads seem to remember things that happened on them, replaying moments over and over for anyone unlucky enough to witness them. Whatever she is, she's still out there, walking the highway near Laredo, waiting for headlights to slow down and for someone kind enough or curious enough to notice her in the dark. I remember this very clearly because it still makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. It was early 2017, a time in my life when things felt stable, even good. I was focused on my work, building my own business, and spending most of my free time at home or with a small circle of people I trusted. Nothing about that period felt dangerous or unstable. Looking back now, that sense of normalcy is what makes the memory so unsettling. There was a former friend of mine named Matthew. We had gone to high school together years earlier. We were never best friends, but we knew each other well enough. We had shared classes, mutual friends, and the usual teenage experiences. After graduation, like most people, we drifted apart. Life moved on. We went different directions, and for a long time, we barely spoke at all. Then, out of nowhere, he started coming around again. At first, it didn't seem strange. People reconnect all the time. He reached out, said he was in the area, and asked if he could stop by. I didn't think much of it. I figured he was just looking to hang out, catch up, and pass some time. I had other friends over occasionally, so when Matthew came by, it blended right into the routine. The nights were simple. We would sit around watching TV, drinking beers, talking about random things. Sometimes we laughed about old high school stories. Other times we just sat quietly, half paying attention to whatever was on the screen. There was nothing dramatic or tense about it. It felt like business as usual. But what stands out now is how often he started showing up. At first, it was once in a while. Then it became more frequent. He would stop by unexpectedly, sometimes asking just a few hours before. I remember thinking it was a little odd, but not enough to raise alarms. I told myself he probably didn't have much going on, or maybe he just liked the company. I didn't want to assume the worst about someone I had known for so long. During that time, my business was doing well. I was making good money, more than I ever had before. I had invested heavily in equipment, tools, and other expensive items that I needed for my work. My house reflected that. There were things inside that clearly showed I was doing well financially. At the time, I felt proud of that. I had worked hard for everything I owned. Matthew noticed. He never came right out and said anything obvious, but he asked questions. At first, they seemed harmless. He asked about my work, how business was going, what kind of equipment I used. I took it as curiosity. People ask those kinds of questions all the time, especially when they see someone doing better than they expected. But then the questions started to feel more specific. He would ask when I usually worked, how often I was home, whether I traveled for business, if I ever left the house empty for long periods of time. He asked about security casually, like it was just conversation. At the time, I didn't connect the dots. I answered vaguely, not thinking much of it. There was also something about his energy that felt off, though I couldn't explain it back then. He wasn't aggressive or threatening. He was calm, almost too calm. He listened more than he talked. He watched everything. I remember catching him looking around my house, not in an obvious way, but like he was mentally taking notes. Still, I ignored the feeling. One night, he came over like usual. We hung out, drank a few beers, watched TV, and talked about nothing important. When he left, it felt no different from any other night. I watched him walk out the door, not knowing that would be the last time I ever saw him. Months passed. Life went on. Work kept me busy. I stopped thinking about Matthew entirely. Then later that same year, I heard something that stopped me cold. Matthew had been arrested. At first I thought it had to be a mistake. I didn't want to believe it. But as more details came out, the truth became impossible to ignore. He had been involved in a murder that happened in 2016, before he had started coming around my place again. The story was horrifying. Matthew and another man he knew had targeted someone they believed had come into a decent amount of money. They planned to rob his house. It wasn't random. They knew what they were doing. They went there with intent. During the robbery, the man was killed. When I read those words, my mind immediately went back to all those nights Matthew had spent in my home. The questions, the sudden interest in my schedule, the way he looked around, the timing of it all. I felt sick. The realization hit me slowly, then all at once. At the time he was coming over more frequently, I was visibly successful. I had expensive equipment, valuable items, a predictable routine, everything someone looking to rob a house would want to know. I started replaying every conversation in my head, every question he asked, every pause, every glance around the room. What I had brushed off as curiosity now felt calculated. What I had thought was harmless now felt like reconnaissance. I don't know for sure what his intentions were. I can't say with absolute certainty that he was planning something against me, but deep down, I believe that's exactly what was happening. He wasn't just hanging out, he was feeling me out, testing boundaries, gathering information. The thought that still haunts me is how close it all felt. He knew where I lived, he knew my habits, he knew what I owned, and he had already been involved in a violent crime. If things had gone slightly differently, if I had been more trusting, if I had shared more details, I don't know what could have happened. It made me question my judgment in a way I never had before. I had always considered myself a good judge of character. I believed I could tell when someone was dangerous. Matthew didn't fit the image I had in my head of someone capable of murder. He wasn't loud or unstable. He didn't threaten anyone. He blended in. He laughed. He drank beer and watched TV like everyone else. That's what scared me the most. Evil didn't announce itself. It sat on my couch. It asked polite questions. It smiled and nodded and waited. When I thought about the man Matthew and his accomplice had killed, I felt a deep sense of guilt, even though I knew logically it wasn't my fault. I wondered if there had been signs someone else had ignored too, if that man had trusted the wrong person the way I almost did. After that, I changed. I became more cautious, more guarded. I stopped letting people into my personal space so easily. If someone wasn't significantly close to me, they didn't need to know details about my life, my schedule, or my finances. I learned that politeness doesn't require full transparency. I also learned to trust my instincts. That subtle feeling I had back then, the one I brushed aside, was there for a reason. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. And I ignored it because I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. Now I know better. The idea that someone capable of murder could sit in my living room, drink my beer, and laugh at the same jokes still unsettles me. It reminds me how thin the line really is between normal life and something much darker. Even now, years later, I think about how easily things could have gone wrong, how close danger can get without making a sound, how people don't always look like what they truly are. Matthew is in prison now. His life is defined by one violent act and the consequences that followed. Mine continued forward, but not unchanged. I carry that experience with me as a quiet warning. Not everyone who smiles at you is your friend. Not everyone who asks questions is just curious. And sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the most ordinary. That experience taught me something I will never forget. Be careful who you let into your world, because sometimes you don't realize how close you came to becoming someone else's story. I still remember how unreal everything felt when it happened, because nothing like that was supposed to happen where I lived. My city is in southwestern Ontario, with a population of around 75,000 people. It's not a big city, but it's not tiny either. It's the kind of place where people feel safe. You recognize faces at grocery stores. You hear about small crimes, maybe break-ins or fights, but nothing truly horrifying. At least, that's what we believed. I lived 9 houses away from a woman who would later be exposed as a murderer and rapist. On New Year's Day in 2013, a young woman named Noelle Paquette was raped and murdered. The people responsible were Tanya Bogdanovich and Michael McGregor. At the time, those names meant nothing to most of us. They were just ordinary people living in the same city, blending into everyday life. That's what makes the entire thing so disturbing. Evil didn't come from some distant place. It was already here. The night it happened started like so many others. Noelle was out at a local bar with her boyfriend. Around 2:30 in the morning, the two of them got into a fight. It wasn't unusual. Bars close late, emotions run high, and arguments happen. She left the bar upset and alone. That should have been the end of it. She should have gone home, slept it off, and woken up to a new year. Instead, she crossed paths with the wrong people. Bogdanovich and McGregor randomly abducted her. There was no prior connection, no long-term plan involving her specifically. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. They forced her into their vehicle at knife point and drove her 18 kilometers to the southern edge of the city. 18 kilometers may not sound like much, but in that moment, it meant being taken far away from lights, people, and help. They brought her to a wooded area, deep enough that no one could hear her screams. What happened there is almost impossible to think about. She was brutally raped and murdered in that forest. Her life taken in one of the most violent and terrifying ways imaginable. As details came out, the story became even more disturbing. Investigators discovered that Bogdanovich and McGregor were involved in fetish websites centered around rape. It wasn't just violence for the sake of violence. They were aroused by it. They felt empowered by it. They shared fantasies and ideas that treated human suffering as entertainment. That knowledge changed how the entire crime felt. This wasn't a moment of rage or panic. It was deliberate. It was something they had thought about, talked about, and wanted to experience. What made it even harder to process was how close this all was to my own life. I was close friends with Bogdanovich's son. He had been to my house many times. Sometimes he even walked over on his own. We talked, laughed, and spent time together like normal kids. His mother was just someone's mom to me. I never would have imagined what she was capable of. The worst realization came later, when I remembered something that made my stomach drop. 10 days before the murder, right before Christmas break, Bogdanovich had been at my school. She stood there during an assembly, surrounded by students, teachers, and parents. She looked completely normal. No one suspected anything. No one felt unsafe. Knowing that someone who would soon commit such a horrific crime stood in the same room as me, watching the same assembly, breathing the same air, still makes my skin crawl. After the murder, the city changed overnight. The street I lived on became almost impossible to drive down. News vans lined the road. Reporters stood outside houses, asking questions. Cameras were everywhere. Neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering, crying, trying to understand how something like this could happen so close to home. There was a sense of hysteria, but also disbelief. People locked their doors more carefully. Parents watched their children more closely. Conversations everywhere revolved around the same questions. How could this happen here? How could no one have noticed? How could someone live among us and do something like this? For me, the fear felt personal. I kept thinking about all the times I had been near that house, all the moments that seemed ordinary at the time. I wondered how many times I had unknowingly been just a few steps away from someone capable of unimaginable violence. The idea that I lived 9 houses away haunted me, not because something happened to me, but because of how easily it could have. The randomness of it all was terrifying. Noelle wasn't targeted because of who she was. She was targeted because she was there. In the days and weeks that followed, the city struggled to return to normal. Memorials appeared. People left flowers, candles, and notes. Strangers hugged each other. There was grief, anger, and fear all mixed together. Everyone felt it, even those who had never met Noelle. What made it worse was that this wasn't the only bad thing happening. Other disturbing stories began to surface in the area around that time. Crimes that once felt distant suddenly felt close. The sense of safety we had taken for granted was cracked, maybe permanently. Even now, years later, I still think about how thin the line is between normal life and horror. How someone can sit at a school assembly, raise a child, live in a quiet neighborhood, and still be capable of something so monstrous. How you can live your life assuming you're safe, only to find out you were closer to danger than you ever realized. That experience changed how I see people. It changed how I see my city. I no longer assume that terrible things only happen somewhere else, to someone else. I understand now that evil doesn't always look evil. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor. Sometimes it looks like a parent. Sometimes it stands quietly in a crowd, unnoticed, living. That close to something so horrific leaves a mark. It makes you more aware, more cautious, and more uneasy in ways that never fully go away. And every New Year's Day, I think about Noelle Paquette, about the life she should have had, and about how one night shattered the illusion of safety for an entire city. I work for a state department that investigates accidents and failures involving fire protection systems. Most people don't even think about these systems unless a fire breaks out. But when they fail, the consequences can be just as deadly as the fires they're meant to stop. My job has taken me to a lot of scenes over the years. I've seen burned buildings, collapsed ceilings, flooded factories, and equipment torn apart in ways that don't seem possible until you're standing there looking at it. But one incident from 2011 has never left me. No matter how many years pass, I still think about it. That year, we were called in to investigate a fatal incident involving a fire protection water system at an industrial site. 2 men had died while working on a water pump inside a concrete block building. On paper, it sounded routine. Upgrading a pump, performing a pressure test, filling a tank. These are things that happen every day in industrial facilities. Nothing about it initially suggested the kind of destruction we would later see. The building itself was not large or impressive. It was a simple concrete block structure, solid and utilitarian, built to house equipment rather than people. Inside was a large metal holding tank connected to the building's fire protection sprinkler system. The tank was designed to store water under pressure so that if a fire broke out, the system would have an immediate supply ready to go. Unfortunately, this particular system had not worked properly for years. The industrial building had continued operating despite the fire protection system being essentially useless. Over time, the tank had rusted. Corrosion had eaten away at the metal, creating weak spots and holes. Instead of replacing the tank, someone had chosen to patch it. Raw metal plates had been welded over the damaged areas, covering rust and corrosion rather than removing it. On the outside, it may have looked like a fix. On the inside, the damage remained. The 2 workers who arrived that day were there to install a new water pump and perform a pressure test on the tank. Their job was to bring the system back online. They were experienced workers, not amateurs. They knew what they were doing, and they followed standard procedures as far as anyone could tell. When they first inspected the tank, they noticed the patches. They reported that sections of raw metal had been welded directly onto the tank to correct rust and holes. That alone should have raised serious concerns. Welding patches onto a pressurized tank is dangerous under the best circumstances. Doing it on a tank that had been out of service for years, with unknown internal corrosion, was a recipe for disaster. Still, the work continued. They installed the new pump and prepared to conduct the pressure test. The process was simple in theory. Slowly fill the tank with water. Monitor pressure levels. Watch for leaks. Stop if anything looks wrong. The goal was to confirm that the tank could safely hold water under the required pressure. As they began filling the tank, problems appeared almost immediately. Water started leaking from multiple areas. Not just a drip or a slow seep, but heavy, visible leaking. The workers knew this wasn't normal. They contacted their supervisor to report what they were seeing. While one of them was on the phone, explaining that the tank was leaking badly and that something wasn't right. The situation escalated faster than anyone could react. The tank ruptured. It didn't crack. It didn't split gently. It exploded. The failure was sudden and violent. Years of hidden corrosion combined with poorly welded patches and increasing internal pressure reached a breaking point. When the tank failed, it released an enormous amount of energy. The water inside, under pressure, turned the tank itself into a weapon. Metal shards were launched in every direction. Pieces of the tank tore through the concrete block walls like paper. Heavy sections of steel were flung across the room with incredible force. The workers, who were standing only feet away, were struck instantly. There was no time to run, no time to react. The force of the explosion killed both men immediately. The violence of the rupture didn't stop there. The pressure wave and flying debris were so powerful that the concrete block building itself collapsed. Walls buckled and fell, the roof came down. What had been a solid structure moments earlier was reduced to rubble. All of this destruction came from a water tank. Not a boiler, not a gas line, not an explosive chemical, just water trapped inside a weakened metal container. When we arrived on scene, the devastation was hard to comprehend. The building was gone, flattened by its own contents. Twisted metal lay scattered among broken concrete blocks. The remains of the tank were barely recognizable. It had torn itself apart so completely that it was difficult to identify which pieces had once been connected. There was a heavy silence over the site. Even experienced investigators felt it. 2 men had gone to work that day expecting a normal job. They never left. As we began our investigation, the full picture started to emerge. The tank had been compromised long before the workers arrived. Corrosion had thinned the metal from the inside, weakening its structural integrity. The welded patches did nothing to address that internal damage. In fact, they likely made things worse by creating uneven stress points when pressure was applied. When the new pump began filling the tank, pressure increased exactly as it was designed to do. But the tank was no longer capable of containing that pressure. The leaks were a warning sign, the last visible indication that failure was imminent. The moment the internal pressure exceeded what the weakened metal could handle, the tank ruptured catastrophically. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was how quickly it all happened. The workers recognized that something was wrong. They reported it. They were in the process of trying to do the right thing. And still, it wasn't enough time. From an investigative standpoint, the cause was clear: improper maintenance, unsafe repairs, failure to replace a severely degraded pressure vessel. A fire protection system that had been neglected for years was suddenly brought back into service without proper evaluation. The result was fatal. From a human standpoint, it was devastating. These men didn't die because of fire. They didn't die because of an explosion caused by fuel or chemicals. They died because of stored energy, because water, when confined and pressurized, becomes incredibly dangerous. People underestimate that all the time. Water feels harmless. We drink it, we bathe in it, we spray it on fires. But inside a sealed tank, under pressure, it holds immense potential energy. When that containment fails, the release is violent and unforgiving. The collapse of the concrete building was proof of that. Concrete block structures are designed to be sturdy. They don't just fall apart. But the force of the rupture was enough to compromise the entire building. It wasn't just an equipment failure, it was a structural failure caused by a single neglected component. In the aftermath, there were investigations, reports, and changes. Policies were reviewed. Procedures were updated. The importance of properly inspecting and replacing aging fire protection components was reinforced. But none of that brought the 2 men back. For me, the case became a permanent reminder of how dangerous complacency can be. Fire protection systems are often ignored because they're only meant to be used in emergencies. When they sit unused for years, people assume they're fine or that they can be patched together later. This incident proved how wrong that assumption can be. Every time I walk into a facility now and see an old water tank, especially one that's been patched or modified, I think about that day. I think about those workers standing next to the tank, doing their job, trusting that the equipment around them wouldn't suddenly turn lethal. I also think about how close this kind of disaster can be to anyone. Industrial buildings exist everywhere. Fire protection systems are everywhere. Most people walk past them without a second thought. They don't realize that behind those walls, there can be enormous forces waiting to be released if something goes wrong. All of this destruction came from a water tank. That fact alone still feels unreal. No flames, no smoke, no explosion in the traditional sense. Just water, pressure, metal, and neglect. And in a single moment, 2 lives were lost. A building was destroyed and a lesson was written in debris and blood. It is one of the clearest examples I've ever seen of how something designed to protect lives can become deadly when it's ignored for too long. And it's why I take my job seriously every single day. Because sometimes the most dangerous things are the ones people think are harmless. We like to believe that we know the people living around us. We wave to them when we get the mail, we make small talk about the weather while taking out the trash, and we trust that behind their closed doors, they are living lives just as normal and mundane as our own. I used to believe that too. I live in a quiet, sleepy subdivision in Arkansas. It is the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happens, where the loudest noise is usually a lawnmower on a Saturday morning. My house is the second to last one on a dead-end road, a cul-de-sac that feels isolated from the rest of the world. The neighbors are friendly people, the kind who bring you cookies at Christmas and watch your cat when you go on vacation. It was a perfect, peaceful bubble, but that bubble popped on a cold morning, shattering my sense of safety forever. It all centered around the last house on the block, the one right next to mine, and the old man who lived there named Edward. Edward was a mystery, but not a scary one, at least not at first. He lived in the house at the very end of the road, just a few yards away from my bedroom window. He was an older man, a war veteran, with the kind of weathered face that told 1,000 stories he never shared. We had spoken a handful of times over the years, but it was never anything deep. He knew my name, and I knew his. He would nod at me when he collected his newspaper, and I would smile back. Over the last year, however, he had become increasingly private. The blinds were always drawn. The yard wasn't kept as tidy as it used to be. We just assumed he was getting older, maybe slowing down. We gave him his space, thinking we were being respectful neighbors. We had no idea that we were giving him the privacy to commit an atrocity. The day that changed my life started before the sun even came up. It was 5:43 a.m. I remember the time exactly because when I woke up, the red numbers on my digital alarm clock were the first thing I saw. I didn't wake up naturally. I was pulled from a deep sleep by a sound that no one wants to hear in the dark. It was a voice, ragged and desperate, yelling my name. At first, in my groggy state, I thought I was dreaming. It sounded like a nightmare, a voice calling out from the void. I lay there for a second, heart pounding, waiting for it to stop. But then my fiancé, who was sleeping next to me, sat up bolt upright. He had heard it too. It wasn't a dream. Someone was outside our house, screaming for us. We didn't even grab jackets. We rushed out of bed, fueled by adrenaline and confusion, and ran to the front door. The morning air was biting cold, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones, but we didn't feel it. We scanned the front yard, looking for the source of the noise, and then we saw him. Lying face down in the dirt, right at the bottom of the concrete stairs leading up to his porch, was Edward. He looked like a heap of old clothes thrown onto the ground. He wasn't moving much, just letting out low groans of pain. We sprinted over to him, our bare feet slapping against the cold grass. When we got close, it was clear he was hurt badly. He was an old man, frail and brittle, and the fall looked serious. His face was pressed into the soil, and his body was twisted in an unnatural way. My fiancée knelt beside him, gently touching his shoulder. We immediately asked him if we should call an ambulance. It seemed like the only logical thing to do, but Edward's reaction was immediate and aggressive. He snapped at us, his voice sharp despite his pain. He told us, "No," he said, "no, just get me up." He didn't want professionals. He didn't want the police. He just wanted to be moved. We tried to reason with him. We told him he might have broken something, that moving him could make it worse. We offered to help him inside his house so he could at least be warm while we figured out what to do. But again, he refused. He was adamant. "No," he barked, "just get me up to the chair on my porch, and I'll be fine." It was a strange request. Who lies face down in the dirt with serious injuries and just wants to sit in a porch chair? But he was panicking, and we wanted to calm him down. My fiancée and I carefully lifted him. He was heavy, dead weight, and he groaned with every movement. We managed to drag him up the few steps and deposited him into the old, rusted chair on his porch. Once he was seated, he slumped over, catching his breath. We asked him what had happened. His story was disjointed. He told us that around 10 p.m. the previous night, he had heard a noise outside. He thought it was a prowler or a stray animal. He came out to investigate in the dark. He claimed that some kind of animal had been on the porch and bolted towards him, scaring him. When he tried to run back inside, he tripped and tumbled down the stairs. My fiancé looked at him with wide eyes. "Oh my God," he said. "You mean you've been lying out here since 10 o'clock last night?" Edward just nodded. He had spent nearly 8 hours lying in the dirt, unable to move in the freezing cold. That fact alone broke my heart. I felt a surge of pity for this lonely old man. I asked him if we could call anyone for him. I knew he had family somewhere, and I was sure I had seen a woman living there with him in the past, his wife. I asked him, "Is your wife living with you? Should we get her?" Edward looked me dead in the eye. His expression was unreadable, masked by the shadows of the early morning. "No," he said firmly, "I live alone." He insisted that there was no one else. He told us to go home, that he would be fine now that he was in his chair. He practically shooed us away. We walked back to our house, shivering now that the adrenaline was wearing off. But something didn't sit right with us. We couldn't just leave an injured war veteran sitting on a porch in the cold after a bad fall. We talked about it in our kitchen, whispering as if he could hear us through the walls. We knew he was hurt. We suspected he might be suffering from dementia or shock. He clearly wasn't making rational decisions. We decided that we had to be the adults in the situation. We called the police. We explained that our elderly neighbor had fallen, that he was confused, and that he was refusing medical help. We asked for a welfare check, just to make sure he was safe. We thought we were doing the right thing. We thought we were being good neighbors. About 15 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. We watched from our living room window, peeking through the blinds. 2 officers stepped out. They walked up the driveway to Edward's house. We saw them approach the porch where we had left him. They knocked on the doorframe, calling out his name. But Edward wasn't in the chair anymore. He must have dragged himself inside. The officers tried the door, but it was locked. They moved around the house, looking into the windows, trying to spot him. One of the officers broke away and started walking across the lawn toward our house. I opened the front door before he could knock. I stepped out onto the porch, hugging my arms around myself. "Did you check on him?" I asked. "Is he okay?" The officer had a strange look on his face. It was grim, serious. He looked at me and said 3 words that stopped my heart. "He's dead," I shouted back at him. "What do you mean he's dead?" We had just spoken to him 20 minutes ago. He was breathing. He was talking. He was sitting in that chair. The officer explained. "We looked through the kitchen window. We can see him lying on the floor. He's not moving. He looks deceased." My stomach dropped. I felt a wave of guilt. If we had just called the ambulance against his will, maybe he would still be alive. The officer told me that his senior partner was calling it in. Since they had visual confirmation of a body and probable cause that he was dead or dying, they had the authority to enter the house. I watched as they went back to Edward's front door. They announced themselves one last time. "Police, we are coming in." Then, with a heavy thud, they kicked the door in. The wood splintered and the door swung open. The officers drew their weapons, just in case, and stepped into the gloom of the house. I stood on my lawn. Waiting. Minutes passed. I expected them to come out and tell me he had had a heart attack or a stroke. But when the officer came back out, he looked pale. He looked sick. It turned out Edward wasn't dead. He had collapsed on the kitchen floor after dragging himself inside, exhausted and broken from his night in the cold. He was alive, barely, but someone else in that house was not. When the officers entered, they were hit by a wall of stench. It was a smell so foul, so heavy, that it seemed to cling to their uniforms. It was the smell of death, but not fresh death. It was the smell of something that had been rotting for a long time. They found Edward on the floor, but their eyes were drawn to the living room. Sitting in an armchair covered by a thick, dusty blanket was a figure. It was the shape of a person. The officers pulled back the blanket. It was Edward's wife. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't sick. She had been dead for months. The coroner later estimated that she had been deceased for anywhere between 4 to 6 months. Her body was in a state of advanced decomposition. She was mummifying in that chair, in that silent living room, while Edward lived his life around her. The windows in the back of the house had been smashed out from the inside. We realized later that Edward had done this to let the smell escape, to keep the house livable while he coexisted with a corpse. That explained why we never saw him, why the blinds were drawn, why he became a recluse. But the horror didn't stop at finding a body. Finding a dead body is tragic. What they found next was monstrous. As the investigators looked closer at the woman in the chair, they noticed something horrifying about her condition. Decomposition does terrible things to a body, but this was different. There were specific marks. There were missing pieces. The skin on her face was gone, not rotted away, but removed. There were precise cuts on her neck and arms. Parts of her looked like they had been sliced off with a knife. The realization hit the investigators like a physical blow. Edward hadn't just been living with his dead wife. He hadn't just been too grief-stricken to let her go. He had been harvesting her. He had been peeling her skin. He had been slicing off meat. He had been eating her. I stood on my lawn as the gurneys were wheeled out. First Edward, strapped down, looking small and pathetic. Then his wife, in a black body bag that seemed too small for a person. The police told us everything later. They had to. We were witnesses. We were the ones who found him. They told us about the knife found in the kitchen. They told us about the evidence of cannibalism. For the past 6 months, while I was watching TV, while I was cooking dinner, while I was sleeping in my bed, the old man 10 yards away was feasting on the flesh of his wife. The phrase WTF doesn't even begin to cover the feeling. It is a complete collapse of reality. You hear about these things in movies or in books about serial killers from 100 years ago. You don't expect it to happen in a quiet subdivision in Arkansas. You don't expect the nice old war veteran next door to be a monster. The most disturbing part, the part that keeps me awake at night, is the conversation we had on the porch. He told us he heard a noise. He told us an animal scared him. That was why he fell. That was why he was stuck outside, which led to us finding him, which led to the police kicking down the door. If he hadn't fallen, if he hadn't tripped on that step, how long would it have gone on? He had no intention of stopping. He had smashed the windows to vent the smell. He was managing the situation. If he hadn't heard that noise, he would have walked back inside, locked the door, and continued his horrific routine. He would have sat in that living room with her. He would have continued to whittle her away, piece by piece. And the question that haunts me the most is simply this. Edward said he heard a noise outside that night. He said something bolted at him. But we live at the end of a dead-end road. It's quiet. There are no stray dogs, no coyotes. I never heard a noise that night. My fiancé never heard a noise. Was there really an animal, or was it something else? Was it the universe finally deciding that enough was enough? Or was it the spirit of the woman in the chair, finally making a noise to scare him, pushing him down those stairs to reveal the hell he had created? I still live in that house. I can't afford to move. But I don't look at the house next door anymore. It sits empty now, boarded up, a hollow shell of wood and brick. But every time I walk to my car, I can feel the weight of it. I can feel the silence of that living room. And I know that true horror isn't a monster in a mask. True horror is what happens behind locked doors in the quietest houses where ordinary people do things that nightmares are made of. When I was a kid, my brother and mom told me that they saw a ghost. At the time, I was the kind of person who needed to see things to believe them. I was convinced they were just trying to mess with me, playing some long-term prank to make me afraid of the dark or to keep me from wandering around the house at night. In our house, we were always joking around, so a story about a spirit felt like just another tall tale. But then they sat me down and told me the story in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. They weren't laughing, and there was a look of genuine, lingering confusion in their eyes that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't a story built on jump scares. It was built on a quiet, impossible reality that had settled into our home during the dead of night. The event took place at exactly 1 a.m., a time when the world feels like it has been abandoned by the sun and left to the mercy of whatever lives in the shadows. My whole family was asleep, or at least we were supposed to be. The house was wrapped in that heavy, suffocating silence that you only find in the middle of the night. My brother Caden was the first one to be pulled out of his sleep. He didn't wake up because of a nightmare or a loud noise. He woke up because of a sound that was so subtle it almost felt like a part of his dream. It was the sound of our bedroom door closing. It wasn't a slam or a click, but a very slow, deliberate movement of wood against the frame. It was the kind of sound that suggests someone is trying very hard not to be heard. Caden opened his eyes and looked toward the doorway. In the dim light filtering in from the hallway, he saw a figure. His heart skipped a beat, but then he felt a wave of confusion. The person walking out of the room looked exactly like him. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was his height, his build, and he was wearing the exact same pajamas Caden had on at that very moment. The figure moved with a strange, fluid grace, stepping through the threshold and into the darkness of the hall. Caden sat there for a second, his mind trying to process the impossibility of what he was seeing. He thought he was just seeing things, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or a vivid dream that had spilled over into reality. He rubbed his eyes and told himself to go back to sleep, dismissing the visual as a trick of the moonlight and his tired brain. But while Caden was trying to drift back into unconsciousness, the ghostly figure continued its journey. It didn't vanish once it left our room. It walked through the hallway with a silent, purposeful stride, heading directly toward my mom's room. The air in the hallway must have been freezing, though no one was there to feel it. The entity reached her door and simply stood there. It didn't knock, and it didn't try to enter. It just lingered in the shadows of the doorway, a presence that was heavy enough to pull my mom out of her sleep. She felt that prickle of awareness that parents often have, the sense that one of their children is standing by the bed, needing a glass of water or comfort after a bad dream. My mom opened her eyes and saw the shape of a boy standing at the entrance to her room. In the gloom, the figure had the unmistakable profile of my brother. Thinking it was just Caden, she stayed in bed and spoke to him in that soft, sleepy voice parents use late at night. She asked the figure, "What is it, Caden? Did you have a bad dream?" She expected the boy to walk over to her or to answer with a groggy explanation, but the figure remained perfectly still. It didn't speak and it didn't move an inch. There was something about the way it stood, too rigid, too silent, that made the sleepiness vanish from her mind instantly. A cold dread began to settle in her stomach. My mum turned around fully, reaching for the lamp on her bedside table, but she stopped before she could even touch it. Now that she was looking directly at the figure, she realized that it wasn't her son at all. It was only a silhouette of him. It was as if someone had cut a hole in the reality of the room in the exact shape of my brother. There were no features, no eyes, no texture to the clothing, just a void of darkness that was deeper and blacker than the rest of the room. Puzzled and starting to feel a surge of protective instinct, she stood up and began to walk toward the doorway. She wanted to reach out and touch it, to prove to herself that it was just a shadow or a trick of the light. As she got within a few feet of the doorway, the thing simply vanished. It didn't fade away or run. It just ceased to exist, as if it had never been there at all. The silence that followed was absolute. My mum stood in the middle of her room, her heart pounding against her ribs, staring at the empty hallway. She was shocked but remained skeptical, her logical mind trying to find a reason for what she had just seen. She was convinced that Caden must be playing a prank, even though the vanishing act was something he couldn't have pulled off. She decided to walk through the house and check on us, expecting to find my brother hiding around a corner or stifling a laugh in his bed. She walked through the hallway, her footsteps sounding like thunder in the quiet house, and pushed open the door to the room I shared with Caden. To her absolute shock, we were both sound asleep. Caden was tucked under his blankets, his breathing deep and rhythmic, and I was in the same state on the other side of the room. There was no way he could have stood in her doorway and then made it back to bed, climbed under the covers, and fallen into a deep sleep in the few seconds it took her to walk down the hall. The reality of the situation hit her like a physical blow. She realized that whatever she had seen in her doorway wasn't her son, but a duplicate, a doppelganger that had emerged from our room while we were unconscious. My mum was terrified. She went back to her room, but the sense of security that a home is supposed to provide had been shattered. She couldn't sleep at all for the rest of that night. She sat up with the lights on, watching the doorway and listening to every creak and groan of the house, wondering if the silhouette would return. It was the weirdest and most disturbing paranormal experience we ever had in that house. It wasn't just a random ghost. It was a ghost that had taken the form of someone she loved, a shadow that had claimed my brother's identity for a few minutes in the middle of the night. When they told me the story later, I realized that the creepy nature of it was far worse than if it had been a traditional scary story. There is something fundamentally fucked up about the idea of a doppelganger. In old folklore, seeing a double of yourself or a family member is often considered a dark omen, a sign that something is wrong or that a tragedy is coming. For Caden to see himself walking out of the room is a specialized kind of horror. It's the idea that your own image can be detached from you, moving through the world with its own unknown intentions. It makes you wonder what that silhouette wanted. Why did it go to my mum's room? Was it trying to communicate, or was it just observing the family while we were at our most vulnerable? The fact that both my brother and my mum saw the same thing from different perspectives is what makes it impossible to dismiss. If it had just been one of them, you could say it was a dream or a hallucination. But for Caden to see it leave the room and for my mum to see it arrive at her door creates a timeline of events that is terrifyingly consistent. It means that for a few minutes at 1:00 a.m., there were two Cadens in the house. One was a sleeping boy, and the other was a silent shadow that had the power to vanish into thin air. I think about that hallway often, especially when I'm the last one awake at night. I think about the space between our rooms and how it once held a void in the shape of a person. The house didn't feel the same after that. Even though we never saw the silhouette again, the memory of it lived in the corners of the rooms. My mum became much more sensitive to the noises of the night, and she never liked it when the doors were left slightly ajar. We began to realize that our home wasn't just a place for us. It was a place that could be visited by things we didn't understand. The silhouette wasn't a monster with claws or a screaming spirit, but its silence and its familiarity were far more haunting. It was a reminder that the world is a much stranger place than we like to admit, and that the people we think we know can have shadows that move on their own. I've looked into stories of doppelgangers since then, trying to find some kind of explanation for what they saw. Some people believe that they are fetches, spirits that appear to warn of an upcoming death or illness. Others think they are a form of astral projection, where a person's spirit leaves their body while they are in a deep sleep. But none of those explanations really fit the feeling of that night. It didn't feel like a warning, and it didn't feel like a part of Caden. It felt like an intruder that had stolen his shape, a guest that had come into our home without an invitation and left without a trace. It was a breach of the sanctuary that we worked so hard to build. My brother Caden doesn't like to talk about it much anymore. I think the idea of seeing himself is something that still bothers him on a deep psychological level. It's a violation of the self, a reminder that we aren't as unique or as solid as we think we are. He still sleeps with his door shut tight, and I don't blame him. The sound of a door closing very slowly is enough to make any of us jump. It's a sound that carries the weight of that night, a reminder of the 1 a.m. visitor who looked just like him. My mum, too, has carried that night with her. She's a strong woman, not easily rattled by ghost stories, but that silhouette is the one thing she can't explain away. Growing up in a house with a history like that changes you. You stop looking at the darkness as just an absence of light and start seeing it as a medium through which things can move. You realize that the joyful life you are living can be interrupted at any moment by something that doesn't follow the rules of physics. We were lucky, I suppose, because the entity didn't do anything malicious. It didn't hurt anyone, and it didn't stay. But the fact that it was there at all is enough to change your perspective forever. It's a story that I tell when people talk about the paranormal, because it's not about a haunted house or a cursed object. It's about a haunted family. The early 2000s were a time when these kinds of stories were often dismissed as urban legends or the result of too much television. But when it happens in your own hallway, to your own mother and brother, it becomes a reality that you have to live with. It proves that the creepy things are often more persistent than the scary ones. A jump scare is over in a second, but a silhouette that stands in your doorway and vanishes stays with you for decades. It's a lingering coldness that you feel whenever the clock hits 1 a.m. It's the question of what if that never goes away. What if she had touched it? What if it had spoken back? I wonder if that silhouette is still out there somewhere, or if it was tied to that specific house and that specific time in our lives. We've moved since then, but the story has followed us to every new home we've lived in. It's a part of our family history now, a dark thread in the tapestry of our lives. Whenever we get together and the conversation turns to the past, someone eventually mentions the silhouette Kaiden. We laugh about it sometimes, but it's a nervous kind of laughter, the kind that people use to keep the fear at bay. We know that we touched something that night, and we know that it might still be out there standing in someone else's doorway. The world is full of these impossible moments, and most of them go unrecorded. We are the only witnesses to that 1 a.m. encounter, and we are the only ones who know the truth of it. It's a burden and a privilege to have seen the veil lift, even if it was only for a few minutes. It makes life feel a bit more mysterious and a bit more dangerous. It reminds us to cherish the people we have, because we never know when we might be looking at a shadow instead of the real thing. My mum's skepticism was her greatest defense, but even that wasn't enough to protect her from the sight of her son's double. As I look back on that kid who didn't believe in ghosts, I wish I could tell him to be a bit more open-minded. I wish I could tell him that the messing with you was actually a desperate attempt to process a trauma, but I'm glad I didn't see it myself. I don't think I could have handled seeing a silhouette of my brother or myself. I prefer to stay in the world of the living, where people have faces and doors stay closed when you shut them. The paranormal is a fascinating thing to talk about, but it's a terrifying thing to live through, especially when it targets your own family in the middle of the night. If you ever find yourself awake at 1:00 a.m. and you hear your bedroom door closing very slowly, don't just go back to sleep. Look at the doorway. See if there is a shadow standing there that doesn't belong. And if you see a silhouette of someone you love, don't be surprised if they don't answer when you call their name. Some guests don't come for a conversation. They just come to be seen. And once they have been seen, they are gone, leaving you with a story that you will be telling for the rest of your life. Our silhouette Caden is still out there in the memory of that house, a silent witness to a night when the darkness took a human shape. The creepy factor is what makes this the weirdest experience we ever had. It wasn't about blood or violence. It was about the uncanny valley of seeing something that looked human but wasn't. It was about the silence of the house and the realization that your eyes were telling you something that your brain knew was impossible. It was a night of pure, unadulterated curiosity and fear. And even now, as an adult, I find myself looking at my brother and wondering if his shadow is still where it's supposed to be. Some things you just never truly get over, and the 1 a.m. ghost is one of them. I hope that by sharing this, it makes you think about your own home and the secrets it might be keeping. We like to think we are the masters of our domain, but we are just temporary residents in a world that is much older and stranger than we are. The silhouette was a reminder of that. It was a visitor from a place where time and identity don't matter, a place that is just on the other side of the hallway at 1 a.m. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never forget that the most horrific things are often the ones that look exactly like the people you love. The memory of my mum walking toward that figure only for it to vanish is the most powerful image of the story. It represents the ultimate frustration of the paranormal, the way it disappears just as you are about to grasp the truth of it. It's a fleeting, haunting moment that leaves you with more questions than answers. And those questions are the things that keep you awake at night. Was it really a ghost? Was it a doppelganger? Or was it something else entirely, something that we don't even have a name for yet? We may never know, but the story will stay with us, a permanent resident of our family's history. Ever since I was a little girl, I wanted to be a midwife. There was something magical about being there when new life came into the world. I loved everything about it. Not even the night shifts, rude patients, or distant fathers could ruin it for me. But everything changed the night a heavily pregnant woman walked into our delivery room. She had no ID and wore a worn tracksuit. She said her name was Greta. I still don't know if that was her real name. She looked pale and underfed, with bloodshot eyes. Her cervix was already 5 centimeters dilated, so Emma, our doctor on duty, decided to admit her. Her vitals were normal. Over the next few hours, labor progressed and we induced delivery. Everything seemed fine at first. Then Greta's body seized up. Her eyes rolled back and thick veins bulged across her belly. I'd never seen anything like it and called for help. But by the time the senior doctor arrived, Greta had calmed down. Soon after, she gave birth to a healthy baby, without any problems. We examined the baby right there in the delivery room. Then I went to the nurse's station to log everything in our system. When I came back, Greta and her baby were gone. We told the hospital administration, But since Greta seemed stable and the baby appeared fine, they did nothing. My warnings that something might be wrong were ignored. The hospital was already overwhelmed. They didn't need more problems. A week later, Greta came back. Same time of night, same clothes. And she was pregnant again. At first I thought someone was playing a joke on me, but when I asked my co-workers about it, they acted like they had no idea what I was talking about. "She was here last week," I said. "You must have sent her home because she wasn't ready yet." "Well, now she definitely is." "Hook her up to the monitor," Emma said. "No, she already gave birth last week." Emma gave me a look that was half concerned, half amused. "Maybe you should stop working nights," she said, and got to work. Everything happened exactly like before. Greta seized up, her eyes rolled back, then suddenly stopped. At exactly 2:45 a.m., she gave birth without complications. Then she disappeared again. This happened 4 more times over the next few weeks. She'd come in, seize up, give birth at 2:45 a.m., and vanish as quietly as she'd arrived. The 5th time, I noticed something on her belly. The veins formed a pattern, a circle with a square inside it. What did it mean? I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I decided to follow her next time. When she showed up again a week later, I told Emma I felt sick and needed to go home. She wasn't happy about it. The hospital was chronically short-staffed, but she let me go. I clocked out, went to the parking lot, and sat in my car where I could see her room. Right at 2:45 a.m., she had her baby. Through the window, I watched my co-workers examine the newborn, then leave the room. Moments later, Greta got up, took her baby, and walked out. A few minutes later, she came out the main entrance and crossed the parking lot. I got out and followed at a distance. She'd just given birth, but walked fast and steady, like it hadn't affected her at all. Sometimes new mothers bounce back quickly, but birth is exhausting. It's like running a 9-month marathon that ends with a triathlon. It takes a toll no matter how fit you are. Greta crossed several streets and turned into the old industrial district. The streetlights barely worked, so I followed her through the shadows until she reached an old warehouse. She stopped at a heavy rusted door. I hid behind a parked truck. I peeked around the corner, but she was gone. Then suddenly, she was behind me. I jumped and hit my head on the truck's cab. "They're waiting for you," she said. "Who?" She didn't answer. She just walked back to the warehouse. The door opened and she went inside. I knew I shouldn't follow her, but I couldn't help myself. The open door pulled at me like a magnet. My fear melted away and turned into something else. Whatever was inside that warehouse, it was meant for me. I belonged there. I'd never been so sure of anything in my life. It was time. They were waiting. Inside, the warehouse was filled with fog. It smelled like my childhood, like the lilies my mother grew, sunscreen and barbecue. Something moved in the fog. Large tentacles glowing neon green came toward me. As they got closer, the colors grew brighter and the smell grew stronger. One tentacle touched me. I saw the pattern on its tip, a circle with a square in the center, and suddenly I understood everything. It was like the knowledge just appeared in my mind. They didn't have to explain. The information was simply there, like something I'd always known but forgotten. They came to our planet, not to attack us, but to hide. They're being hunted. Their species is being wiped out. Only a few survive. Those survivors fled to Earth. Here they want to start over, but hidden inside human bodies. They're disguising their DNA as human because humans are protected. Unlike most species in the galaxy, humans can't be touched. Earth can't be invaded. Destroying humanity would throw the entire galactic system out of balance, so they found a way to use that protection for themselves. And I'm part of it. I always have been. Suddenly everything went white, blinding light. My head throbbed. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The pain spread through my whole body. For a moment I felt like I was breaking apart. like a crab thrown into boiling water. When the light faded, I was standing in a hallway. I recognized it. It was our delivery ward. I looked down. I was pregnant. "Can I help you?" someone said behind me. It was Emma, but she didn't recognize me. She looked concerned. "Come with me." She touched my arm gently and led me into an exam room. "What's your name?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "Greta."